The Roman Knights of Feralia. Asleep to the stories of the world narration. The air in ancient Rome was heavy with the scent of olives, smoke, and fading warmth. The sun had long fallen behind the Tiber's slow, golden curve, and the streets glowed faintly beneath the watch of lamps and hearths. It was a time between times, after the harvest, before the winter, when even the gods seemed to breathe slower. In those twilight hours, the Romans remembered the unseen. They called it Feralia, a day, a night, a threshold. It was the festival when the dead were not distant, when the silence of tombs seemed to murmur softly back to the living. But this story is not just of Feralia. It is of how the Romans, masters of empire and order, inherited a whisper from older lands. How, upon the misted hills of the north, they met a people who danced with their dead in the firelight. And in that meeting, the Romans' world shifted forever. For there, among the Celts, in lands veiled by fog and myth, the Romans encountered Samhain, a celebration of endings and beginnings, of harvest and spirit, of death as a doorway, not a loss. And from that meeting, the Roman autumn began to change. When the legions marched through Gaul and across the rugged cliffs of Britannia, the empire stretched like bronze fingers across the world. But in the conquered hills, they found a power unlike any army. A quiet reverence for the dying of the year. The Celts lit their bonfires on high ridges, watching the veil between worlds tremble in the smoke. The Romans, who had their own rituals for the departed, recognized something familiar, something older than empire. They brought their own customs northward, Feralia, to honor the ancestors, Lemuria, to soothe the restless ghosts, and Pomona's feast, to thank the goddess of fruit and plenty. Over years and centuries, these sacred threads wove together until the Roman heart beat in rhythm with the Celtic earth. Thus was born a Roman autumn that glowed with flickering lamps, fragrant apples, offerings for the dead, and whispered prayers in the still night. It began with Feralia. In the old Roman calendar, Feralia fell in late February, when the chill still clung to the fields, and buds were only a promise. It was the final day of the parentalia, the festival of the ancestors, when families tended to the graves of their loved ones. At dawn, the streets would be quiet. Women walked to the necropolis outside the city walls, carrying baskets of bread, salt, and wine. They placed them before carved names and garlanded urns, murmuring words meant for ears no longer living. The poets wrote of it softly. Ovid said, "It is a pious duty to appease the souls of our fathers." He warned that if one neglected Feralia, the dead might return hungry, cold, and displeased. And so, Rome remembered. Fathers, mothers, sons, each brought something simple: grains, wine, violets, and crumbs of bread soaked in honey. They believed that these small acts fed the manes, the gentle spirits of the dead family. The necropolis became a garden of lamps that glowed like fallen stars along the Via Appia. As the night deepened, one could imagine the faint rustle of unseen feet, the souls of ancestors returning briefly, warmed by offerings, comforted by remembrance. But Feralia was not only a night of peace. Beneath it stirred the memory of darker spirits, lemures, the unquiet dead. These were not the beloved ancestors, but the forgotten ones, those who had died unjustly or without proper burial. To calm them, Romans kept another ritual, Lemuria, held in May, when the blossoms fell and the world smelled faintly of dust and life entwined. The master of the house would rise at midnight, barefoot and cast black beans behind him. He would chant softly, "With these I redeem myself and mine." It was said the ghosts would follow, gathering the beans as offerings, and by dawn they would fade again into the shadows. When Rome met the Celtic North, these rituals changed. The Romans saw that the Celts had no fear of their dead. They spoke to them as kin, welcomed them by firelight, and believed the spirits returned not to harm, but to visit. And so, in time, the Roman Feralia absorbed this gentleness, the sense that death was not to be feared, but understood. As Rome's legions settled into the misty reaches of Britannia, the customs of the north began to wrap themselves quietly around the empire's heart. The Roman settlers, veterans, and merchants who stayed in those cold provinces found that their own sacred days felt incomplete without the flicker of Celtic fire. They began to move their remembrances from February to autumn, matching the Celtic turning of the year, the dying of the light, the season when spirits walked. It was practical, too. Winter was near, the harvest was done, and the world itself seemed to stand between life and silence. Soon, Feralia took root among the fallen leaves and early frosts of October. Bonfires rose across the Romanized countryside, first in the villas, then in the small farms, then across the hills themselves. From the hills of Gaul to the edges of Britannia, villagers gathered. Roman mothers in woolen cloaks stood beside Celtic druids in linen robes. Children ran through the smoke carrying torches, and soldiers, homesick for Italy, whispered prayers to their ancestors, mixing Latin and the strange northern tongues. Above them all, the stars glittered like embers, distant and eternal. In the small towns, shrines to Pomona, goddess of fruit and abundance, were decorated with wreaths of apples and pears. She was not a goddess of war or thunder, but of quiet gratitude, the sweetness of the earth's final gift before it slept. Her symbol was the apple, and the Romans believed her touch lingered on every orchard. In her honor, they played games, children trying to catch apples from floating basins of water, a practice that would later survive for centuries, known still as apple bobbing. They said that if a girl caught the first apple on the first try, Pomona herself had blessed her with love and fortune. Around her altars, people sang softly while the night stretched long. Lutes, flutes, and the hum of voices filled the cold air, and even as they honored the dead, they celebrated the living, the harvest, the warmth of the hearth, and the brief flame of life itself. Further south, in Rome, the grand cemeteries beyond the city walls filled again with families during Feralia. The necropolis was a silent city of its own, lined with marble tombs and terracotta urns. The flickering light of oil lamps spilled across names etched in Latin: Marcus Lucius, beloved son; Julia Prima, devoted mother; Gaius, soldier of the 10th Legion. At sunset, the hum of prayers began. Some Romans sat quietly and spoke as though their loved ones could still hear. Others sang softly. A few even laughed, the laughter of memory, of stories retold, of love that time could not erase. Wine was poured into small holes carved into the tombs so the spirits might drink. Violets were placed upon the stones. Children played at the edges, collecting fallen petals. In that mingling of sorrow and peace, one could feel the heart of the Roman soul, its belief that duty, remembrance, and reverence bound the world together, even across the river of death. And yet, As all human hearts do, the Romans feared the unknown. They believed the lemures, the wandering dead, might linger, cold and unsatisfied. In the countryside, farmers hung charms of bronze or bone on their doorways to keep them away. Small dogs were set to guard the boundaries of the homes, barking through the night as if they could sense the invisible. But in the lands of the north, the people took a different approach. Instead of banishing the spirits, they welcomed them with firelight, feasts, and open doors. When the Romans saw this, they were intrigued. Slowly, their fear softened into wonder. Soon they began to leave lamps burning through the night, not to repel the dead, but to guide them home. They left plates of bread and wine on their tables and whispered, "Be at peace. You are remembered." It was in these quiet gestures that the Roman and Celtic worlds began to merge, the solemn order of Rome meeting the mystic warmth of the north. By the 2nd century AD, across the empire's vast stretch, from the marble temples of Rome to the mist-covered forts of Britannia, Feralia and Samhain had become twins, joined by spirit and season. The people called it by many names. In some regions, it was the Feast of the Dead. In others, simply the Night of Lamps. Everywhere, though, the feeling was the same. The year was dying, but not in despair. It was a time to honor what had been, to light a candle against the long dark, and to remember that every ending carried the seed of renewal. And when the Romans looked into those flames, they no longer saw only the shadows of ghosts. They saw family, memory, and the great cycle that even the gods obeyed, the endless turning between life and death. At the heart of Rome itself, in the month that would one day belong to Halloween, the winds grew cool and the sky dimmed early. In the narrow streets, oil lamps burned before the household shrines, the Feralia, where small figurines of ancestors stood beside images of the household gods. Each flickering light was both prayer and promise, a recognition that the living were never alone. Children learned the stories of those who came before them, of soldiers who never returned, of mothers who protected their families even in death. They grew up believing what the world was layered, the visible and the unseen, intertwined like smoke and air. As the centuries rolled on, the empire itself began to change. New faiths spread. Old gods fell silent, but the people still kept their autumn fires. Even when they spoke new prayers, they still lit lamps for the dead. For traditions, like souls, do not die, they transform. In every Roman house, there were 2 small altars that mattered most when the seasons leaned toward night. One for the Lares, guardians of the thresholds and the roads, and one for the Penates, keepers of the pantry and the family's daily bread. When the first true cold found its way through shutters and under doors, families set fresh wreaths above these altars and swept the hearth clean, as if preparing a guest room for travelers who had been gone too long. That was the feeling of Feralia after Rome had learned the northern winds: preparation, attendance, and a setting of places for those who were absent in body, but near in memory. In a courtyard near the Aventine, a grandmother taught her granddaughter how to grind violets with oil in a small mortar, staining the pestle purple. They dipped wicks through the scented liquid and let them harden on a marble step, then fitted them to clay lamps. The girl watched the tiny fires bloom and gleam on the bronze of the household shrine. "For your great-grandfather," the grandmother whispered. "He loved the smell of violets in spring." light brings them home. Across the sea in Eboracum, that northern city of stone where the wind found every seam of every wall, a retired legionary laid out 9 fabae nigre, black beans, on a wooden plate. He rose when the moon crested the garrison roofs and walked barefoot through his villa, the flagstones cold as a riverbed. With each beam he cast behind his shoulder, he murmured the old formula he had learned as a boy on the Tiber's banks. With these I redeem myself and mine. At the threshold he paused, clapped his hands softly 9 times to scatter what could not be seen, and listened to the stillness answer him. He felt no dread, only duty, as natural as oiling one's shield or sharpening a plowshare. In Lutetia, where mist braided itself around the bridges and the market stalls, the night markets glowed with late fruit. Apples blushed in heaped baskets, pears leaned against each other like sleeping birds, and the sellers, wrapped in rough wool, called blessings of Pomona into the lantern light. Children darted to the river's edge, where shallow basins had been set with floating fruit. They laughed and fell and laughed again, teeth and breath flashing in the chill. A priestess from an Italian household, her hair braided with vine, blessed the basins with a tilt of wine. "For Pomona," she said, "and for the sweetness that outlasts the frost." All over the empire, autumn was a low music. Each town and farm found its own pitch, its own tempo. In the old Latin countryside, the Via Appia Antica glimmered like a thread of dull gold as the necropolis lamps kindled one by one. Widows pressed their palms to engraved names. Sons ran their fingers through the stone letters of fathers they barely remembered. Sisters left folded scraps of linen embroidered with careful initials no one living could read. Wine dark as pomegranate blood bled through libation holes to the urns below. Bread cooled on tomb steps, dusted with poppy and honey. The air smelled of smoke and figs and that mineral odor of cold stone. Yet it was in the provinces that the weave tightened between Roman rite and northern knowing. There, on hilltops that had known bonfires long before the first legionary hammered a stake into the turf, people stood in rings and watched sparks float into the black. The Roman priest spoke Latin invocations, and the local elder answered in a tongue older than the road beneath their feet. They did not argue over the names of the dead. They shared the work of welcoming them. One laid garlands, the other lit torches. One poured wine, the other scattered grain. The night accepted both. We hear of a mundus, too, a pit long considered a mouth to the underworld, opened on days appointed by the old calendar, so that the lower and upper worlds might breathe through the same reed. Some said they could feel a change in the air when the mundus was uncovered. A cooler draft, yes, but also a dilation, as if the world had briefly widened to admit what it usually kept behind the curtain. Those who tended such places kept silence when they worked, not from fear, but from attention, a listening that belonged to farmers and sailors, and anyone who had ever waited for a sign larger than themselves. In a small town of Cisalpine Gaul, a baker named Marcia woke before the 6th hour to knead a dough she made only once a year. She folded honey into it, and a measure of wine, and a whisper of rosemary. Each loaf she pressed with a thumbprint and a sprig of laurel. When they cooled, she carried them out past the last house, down a lane lined with cypress. The tomb of her mother, plain, square, honest stone, waited where the lane met the field. Marcia set a lamp on the corner and a loaf on the ledge, and spoke a practical prayer. "I still measure the flour the way you taught me. The bread still rises when I count to the same number. Stay near. Keep the ovens even. Guard the deliveries at dawn. When she turned to go, the lamp flame dipped and steadied, and she smiled as if at an answer. In Colonia Agrippina, a cohort clerk spent his Feralia copying names by lamplight, rolls of men who had fallen at rivers whose names the clerk could hardly pronounce. He did not know their faces, but he knew the small notations made by their comrades, sang softly when he sharpened his blade, could carve a horse that looked alive, saved too from the flood. He kept the list, as one keeps a relic, and poured a small libation into the cracks of the barracks step, not because the ritual demanded it, but because the paper in his hands felt like a chapel. If there was fear, it belonged not to the remembered dead, the mains, but to the unmoored shades, the lemures, who arrived like drafts through poor ceiling and hunger through thin walls. Those the households addressed with beans and thresholds and simple words of dismissal. But even that fear softened where the northern fires burned bright. The Romans learned to set an extra stool near the hearth and to pretend, as the hour grew thin, that the empty seat was occupied. They did it first for children who asked whether their grandmothers were coming, and they kept doing it when the children were grown because the gesture made the room feel truer. The old ones said that hospitality was the first virtue of any house that wished for luck, whether the guest had a body or not. There were masks sometimes, not the rowdy Saturnalia kind, but quiet visors of bark or painted fabric, stylized faces with wide eyes and small mouths. These were worn by those who took the role of messengers, walking from door to door, not for mischief, but to gather offerings for the communal fire. A masked girl would knock and say, "For those who cannot knock," and the house would give bread or a little oil, which the messenger carried without speaking. When the offerings were piled near the bonfire, the masks were hung on a post, and no one would touch them until dawn. The augurs, watchers of birds and lightning, stepped softly through these nights. They were trained to read omens in the sky, but in autumn their eyes turned lower, to ashes, to the way a flame leaned in windless air, to the pattern of gnats above a lamp. A flame that bowed and would not right itself suggested a guest at the threshold. Two flames bending toward each other meant reconciliation. A lamp that refused to catch, even with a good wick, even with good oil, was a name remembered too late. The augur said nothing. He only set another lamp beside the stubborn one and tried again, and the second flame took as if satisfied. The empire's roads did not end where the living did. On Feralia, travelers tied little bundles of food to the mile markers, a fig, a crust, and a sliver of cheese wrapped in cloth. Not much, but enough that anyone fleeing cold, man or shade, might take it without shame. If, in the morning, the cloths were empty, people did not weigh the possibilities. They accepted the emptiness as the point. At times, a reader of histories might protest and say that Rome kept Feralia in late winter, that Lemuria belonged to May, and that Pomona's merriment had its own place and hour. And the reader would be right, on the calendar. But calendars are bones, and culture is breath. When Rome's breath moved over the high ridges of the north, it carried the smoke of October fires back with it. The rites did not break. They bent like willow to weather. Festivals slid toward the colder moons, not by decree, but by the slow consent of households that found their memories easiest to hold when the air itself was remembering the sun. So the Roman night learned to sound like this: a far dog calling, the snap of orchard twigs underfoot, the ripple of liquid in a libation bowl, a child's whisper, the rattle of beans on tile, a hand brushing a name in dust, and a flame correcting itself upright. No single sound commanded the others. Together they made the hush that falls when a family waits for everyone to arrive, even those who will not turn the latch. And above it all, the sky kept its own counsel. Stars laid out the same cold map they had offered to shepherds and sailors since before the first road was drawn. If a soul needed direction, there it was. Not a path exactly, but a kind of company. On such nights, no one in Rome or Gaul or Britain felt entirely alone. The living shared a roof with their dead, and the world, for a few hours, was perfectly full. When the dawn finally came to those nights of remembrance, it crept softly, hesitant, as though unsure it was welcome. The mists over the fields were pale as breath. The fires on the hills were no more than thin lines of smoke, and the air itself seemed changed, weighted with something quiet and sacred. Those who had kept the lamps burning through the long hours did not rush to snuff them out. They let the oil finish slowly until each wick bent in its own time and went dark on its own. The Romans called such mornings dies pio, the blessed day, when the world had been washed by communion between the living and the departed. Markets opened later than usual. The baker sold what bread remained from the night before, now a little stale but precious, believed to be touched by ancestral favor. The farmers, before tending their fields again, scattered a handful of last year's grain into the soil with their bare hands, murmuring, "For those who kept us fed when they walked beside us." The empire thrived on order, on timetables and law, but Feralia belonged to another rhythm entirely. It moved at the pace of memory, slow, circular, and tender. In the far provinces, the day after the lamps went dark was one of mending. Neighbors who had quarreled might bring each other gifts, debts might be forgiven, and a feast might be shared in the same fields where the fire had burned. The dead were believed to approve of reconciliation. Peace among the living was their truest offering. The more the Romans lived among the Celts, the more that sense of renewal replaced their fear. The season became less about banishment and more about balance. For every ghost wandering, there was a hearth waiting. For every cold hand, a cup of wine. By the 3rd century, when Rome was a vast organism of marble and mud, stretching from Africa to the edge of mist itself, Feralia had transformed from a single festival into a tone, an atmosphere that hung over the whole turning of the year. Travelers spoke of certain evenings when they could feel the veil thin even on the road, when every sound carried farther, and the air smelled faintly of fruit and ash. Inns along the great roads kept a lamp burning at the gate and a loaf on a stool. No guest, visible or not, should find a door shut. Even emperors, for all their marble and ceremony, could not keep the season from their hearts. Marcus Aurelius wrote in one of his meditations, "The man who honors his dead fathers honors himself." It was philosophy, yes, but it was also ritual. Rome's way of remembering that death was only another citizenship, and the empire of souls was older than any crown. In villas across Latium, mosaics depicted vines curling into skulls, torches crossing with olive branches, and life and death joined like dancers. Artisans carved Lares with softer eyes, their features human, rather than godlike, as if the sculptor meant to catch a hint of his own mother's face in the clay. Even the stone was learning to remember. Then came Pomona's day, bright and fragrant after so much stillness. The same people who had spent the night whispering to the dead now filled their courtyards with laughter. The goddess of the orchards did not chase away the ghosts. She simply offered them sweetness. Her priests taught that fruit was the final word of the year, the proof that decay and delight shared the same stem. In the countryside, garlands of ivy and apple branches were strung over doors. Children painted faces on gourds and melons, not to frighten, but to amuse, tiny guardians of the house. These were not yet the carved pumpkins of later ages, but they were cousins of the idea. A lamp within a hollow fruit, light shining from something that had once grown in the soil. Young couples walked through the orchards hand in hand, pulling down the last apples and tossing them into baskets of leaves. The elders told them that Pomona watched from every branch, smiling beneath her crown of vines. When night returned, they gathered around the fire to eat roasted nuts and apples dipped in honey, speaking of love and harvest and time itself. And so the Romans learned to let joy and mourning share the same fire. To remember the dead was also to celebrate the harvest. To honor loss was to praise plenty. In the distant provinces, the lines blurred further still. Among the Gauls, Feralia was marked by dances around tall torches, the dancers wearing veils or laurels. Among the Britons, it took on songs of farewell sung in a minor key, soft as prayer. Among the Germans at the empire's edge, the lamps burned in hollowed turnips, their smoke curling through the pine-scented night. Each place gave the ritual a new face, yet all faces turned toward the same mystery. A traveler could have gone from the gates of Rome to the cliffs of Caledonia and found in every village the same things: a fire, a loaf, a whisper for the dead, and a fruit gleaming in the lamplight. It was as if the world itself, vast as it had become, agreed for one evening to remember that it was one family. Later, as centuries unwound and empires trembled, new faiths arrived. Faiths that spoke of resurrection, of saints, of eternal light. The old gods were renamed or laid aside, but the customs proved more enduring than marble. The Church declared the Feast of All Saints and later All Souls' Day, placing them, perhaps by accident, perhaps by instinct, at the same moment when Rome had always spoken to its dead, and the people, still keeping their lamps and their loaves, simply changed the names they whispered. Feralia became All Souls. Pomona's feast became the harvest festival. Lemuria's beans were forgotten, but the idea of giving food to wandering souls survived, in treats offered to those who knocked on the door, for the souls departed. And so the Roman autumn lived on, wrapped in new robes, carrying its old heart. But before that transformation, before centuries blurred the lines, there was one last golden age of Roman remembrance, when the roads were still alive with soldiers and traders, when temples still rang with prayers to the old gods. It was an age when Feralia glowed with its full radiance, a night of lamps stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Gaul, a night when every fire along the empire's spine whispered the same message into the dark: we remember. Imagine the empire then, breathing in unison beneath a canopy of shared flame. From the marble courtyards of the Palatine Hill to the rain-soaked villas beyond the Rhine, The glow of thousands upon thousands of lamps shimmered like constellations fallen to earth. If a traveler could have looked from the clouds, he would have seen a necklace of fire encircling the world, a band of light pulsing across Rome's endless provinces. In those nights of Feralia, time felt slower, heavier, almost merciful. The work of the harvest was done, the accounts balanced, and the soldiers resting between campaigns. The empire, for all its weight, seemed to pause in reverence. Even the rivers flowed more quietly. Families gathered in atriums or courtyards. They spoke of those who had gone before, farmers and mothers, soldiers and scholars, slaves and freedmen. No one's name was too small to remember. The dead were not distant gods, but companions in another room. The Romans believed that memory itself nourished the soul. To speak a name aloud was to feed it. So they spoke. An old senator recalled his first teacher, whose voice he could still hear when he read aloud. A stonemason spoke of his brother who had fallen from scaffolding and whose unfinished column still stood outside the city gate. A mother whispered to her infant son about the grandmother he would never meet. Every word was an offering, every breath a bridge across centuries. The offerings themselves were humble, bowls of spelt and barley, small loaves baked with honey, and violets laid in rings. A drop of wine was poured for each ancestor remembered. The ritual was deliberate and unhurried, as though each movement polished the invisible thread between the worlds. And when the last cup had been emptied, the lamps were left to burn through the night. The Romans said that the manes, the benevolent spirits of the dead, would follow the light home, rest a while near their family's fire, and depart at dawn satisfied. In some homes, children claimed to hear soft footsteps in the corridors, or to feel a gentle hand brush their hair. The adults smiled, neither confirming nor denying. Whether it was a dream or a visitation didn't matter. The feeling was what counted, the sense that life's circle was still unbroken. There were processions, too, though quieter than the triumphs of war. Along the Appian Way, priests in dark robes carried torches and sang hymns to Mercury, the guide of souls. Their voices echoed between the tombs and olive trees, deep and resonant. A gentle breeze scattered petals across the road, and the moon gilded the stones like polished silver. At the end of the procession stood the oldest priest, holding a basin of wine. He poured it upon the earth and said in a voice that seemed to belong to the earth itself, "What was born returns. What was bright dims. What was loved endures." The crowd repeated the words softly, some weeping, some smiling. It was a prayer, a promise, and an acceptance all at once. In the distant provinces, Feralia took on colors unknown to Rome. In Egypt, families floated lamps down the Nile, watching them drift like stars upon the dark water. In Gaul, villagers hung ribbons from oak trees, each ribbon bearing the name of someone missed. In Hispania, they set out small cakes shaped like moons, symbols of renewal. Each place honored its dead in its own tongue, but the meaning never changed. Life was a flame passed hand to hand, never extinguished, only transferred. The Celts had once believed that during Samhain, the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for spirits to cross freely. The Romans, more orderly in their thinking, softened that mystery into ritual, rules for visiting hours between the living and the dead. Yet the feeling remained the same. Awe, love, and the quiet acknowledgement that the universe breathed in two directions at once. The night itself had a music all its own. You could hear it in the rhythm of sandals over stone, the sigh of cypress branches in the wind, and the faint crackle of oil lamps. Every sound seemed magnified, intimate. When a dog barked, the echo lingered. When someone whispered, the air seemed to carry it farther than it should. Even the smells of the night told the story. The sweetness of wine, the bitterness of smoke, and the faint mineral tang of marble cooling under starlight. For the Romans, the senses were sacred. To smell the same incense one's ancestors had burned, to see the same constellations they once saw. These were proofs of continuity. At midnight, when the fires had dimmed and the city lay wrapped in silence, some Romans claimed they could feel the veil flutter like a curtains in the wind. Not with fear, but with familiarity, like hearing an old friend breathe behind a door. For a few centuries, this peace endured. Feralia was a hinge between worlds, not a wall. It held Rome together in ways politics never could. Even slaves and masters shared the same rituals. Death, after all, was the great equalizer. But time, relentless and patient, changes all things. The empire began to wane. Roads cracked, temples fell quiet, and soldiers grew weary of conquest. Yet, even as new gods and new empires rose, the lamps of Feralia kept burning, quietly, privately, almost invisibly. A farmer in Gaul might call it something else by then. A monk in a converted temple might light a candle and think of it as prayer. Still, the essence was there, light for the dark, remembrance for the forgotten, and warmth against the cold. That is how the Romans' version of Halloween survived. It never died. It simply changed its name. In the years that followed, those same lamps and fires found new homes under Christian roofs. The Latin Feralia became part of All Hallows' Eve. The cakes and loaves turned into soul cakes. The lamps and gourds became jack-o'-lanterns. The masked children carrying offerings became the trick-or-treaters of a later world. And if you listen closely, even now, you can still hear the echo of Rome in the laughter of those children. The flicker of their candles is the same light that once burned on the Appian Way, guiding the Mains home. The apples in their games are Pomona's fruit. The stories told by firelight are the same that once drifted between Latin and Celtic tongues 2,000 years ago. The festival remains ancient and ageless, disguised beneath new words but carrying the same pulse. A celebration of memory, of warmth, of the fragile beauty of being alive among ghosts. And so, the centuries turned like a wheel. Each spoke carrying traces of the old world into the new. The grand temples of Jupiter and Venus fell silent, their stones quarried for cathedrals. Latin softened into new tongues. Empires rose and dissolved like mist in morning light. Yet every autumn, when the air thinned and the leaves burned gold, some part of Rome stirred again. In the countryside of Italy, farmers still left bread and wine on their tables at night, saying it was for the saints, but in their hearts they knew it was for family long gone. In France, children still floated apple skins in bowls of water to read their fortune, as their ancestors had done for Pomona. In Britain, where Rome's legions had once met the Druids' fires, villagers carved faces into root vegetables to frighten away the restless, or invite them to laugh instead. The gestures changed their names, but not their meanings. Everywhere there remained the same impulse, the wish to remember, to thank, to stand in the dark and say, "We are still here, and so are you." If we could walk now through that ancient world on the night of Feralia, we would see a tapestry of lights more beautiful than any empire's crown. The lamps would flicker along the roads and hillsides. The air would shimmer with incense and smoke. The voices of thousands would rise and fall like waves upon the sea. We might pass a villa where an old man sits before the hearth, speaking to the carved bust of his father. His tone is neither sorrowful nor fearful. It is the easy cadence of conversation. "I've kept the vineyards well," he says softly. "The harvest was good this year. The boy has your hands." Down the road, a young couple offers apples and chestnuts to Pomona, their laughter echoing in the night. Beyond them, children run in circles, their torches glowing like fireflies. In a small temple courtyard, a priest kneels beside a lamp and recites lines older than his city. "Shine for the ones who walked before us. Guide them through the wind and mist. Let no soul go hungry, no spirit go cold." The flame dances, golden and steady, as though it understands. Later, when the fires die down and sleep gathers the world again, the Romans dream. In those dreams, they walk among their ancestors. They see familiar faces in the soft light: the father, the friend, the lost child. And they do not speak in words, but in the language of memory. They exchange the warmth of recognition and the comfort of continuity. The dead are not ghosts there, not strangers, but mirrors. When the dreamers wake, they remember little, only the faint scent of violets and smoke, and a strange calm that lingers in the heart. They step outside and find the dawn mist curling like breath along the ground, the lamps extinguished, but the air still touched by their glow. Somewhere, a rooster calls. Somewhere, a child laughs. The world begins again. This, then, was the Romans' version of Halloween. Not the night of terror it would one day become, but a quiet symphony of gratitude and grace. It was an evening when fire, fruit, and faith intertwined, when memory was stronger than death, when every flame was a bridge and every shadow a guest. Through Feralia, the Romans taught the world that remembrance could be sacred without sorrow, that to honor the dead was to strengthen the living. And though the marble of their temples has crumbled, and their empire has long since fallen, the essence of their ritual endures. In every candle lit on a windowsill, in every apple offered, and in every whisper to those who came before. When you stand by your own small light on an autumn night, know that you are standing in their company. The same stars that watched over Rome still burn above you. The same thin veil still shimmers between worlds. The same love that filled those ancient courtyards still flows through every heart that remembers. And if by chance you hear a rustle just beyond the edge of the firelight, a footstep, a sigh, the faintest echo of a voice, smile. It is only the past passing by, pausing for a moment to listen to the living. The Roman Knights of Feralia. Even now, the story continues. In every lamp that burns through the night, in every fruit that ripens at the year's end, and in every quiet act of remembrance, the Romans' Halloween still breathes, softly, endlessly, like a flame that refuses to die.